Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to our summer speaker series on democratizing work after the pandemic. My name is Pavlina Cherneva. I teach economics at Bard College and my research associate at the Levy Economics Institute, as well as I direct the new Economic Democracy Initiative at the newly formed Open Society University Network. So I'm especially pleased to welcome this group of students and guests who are coming from all corners of the world. But I'm even more pleased to welcome our special guest today, my colleague and dear friend, Daniel Kostzer, who has a very long list of accolades to his name. So I will try to give you some of them. Daniel just recently finished a stint as a regional, senior regional wage specialist in the International Labor Organization for Asia and the Pacific. And he has served as the coordinator for the social development cluster at the UNDP's Buenos Aires office. I met Daniel when he was a director of research and macroeconomic coordination at the Department of Labor in Argentina. He was he really was the primary reason why Argentina, I would say, one of the main reasons why Argentina embarked on a very bold, ambitious employment program plan, HEFES. And he was overseeing the implementation of this program, which is essentially a precursor to the job guarantee. Daniel is the economist that I frequently refer to when I talk about the phone call that I received in my office one day, who said, you guys are working on the employer last resort, and I listened to one of your conference presentations, and do you know that I've been trying to push this proposal in our ministry for several years? And then the depths of the recession in Argentina, that was the emergency policy response. He also organized several research trips for myself and colleagues, and provided invaluable assistance as we studied and we conducted site visits. Daniel has been a consultant for the ILO, for ECLAC, for UNDP on issues related to employment, income distribution, and employment policies. He was an alternative executive director at the World Bank. He worked at the UNDP Myanmar office. You should know, Daniel, we actually have students from Myanmar joining us today. He was also head of the socioeconomic unit of the UN integrated mission in Timor-Leste for some time. He has also been a lecturer on the Argentinian social structure at the University of Buenos Aires, a visiting professor of labor economics at UMKC, a research associate at the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability, where I worked for a number of years, and a member of the editorial committee of the journal Estudios del Trabajo of ASET. That's the Association of Labor Studies Experts in Argentina. Again, formerly, he was also an advisor of the National Lower Chamber and director of the Center of Studies of Argentinian Northern Region. It's really a pleasure to have you here, Daniel. Welcome to our summer seminar.
Thank you very much, Pav. For me, it's also a pleasure to return to the old roots. The employment programs nowadays with the pandemic became again a major issue. And sometimes for some people, they foresee like a contradiction between employment programs and the minimum wage idea. So my idea is to try to convince everybody that this very simple, all, I would say, minor, according to the canonical wisdom, instrument of labor markets, of wage policies, like the minimum wage, it's so central, it's so important, not only for normal or regular times, but also for the recovery even in the framework of the implementation of a massive employment program or an employment guarantee type of program. You mentioned that I was one of the drivers or whatever of the Jefes program, and I would like to say that the main driver was the crisis. Yeah, unfortunately, if it wouldn't be for the crisis and the people shouting, picketing, protesting in the streets, we wouldn't ever have an employment program, which is a major mistake, because after all our experience, all the things that we saw, we found that it's easier, better, and more efficient to implement an employment program, an employment guarantee program in regular times, in regular economic growth, because it plays one of the roles that we will discuss later, than to start implementing in the middle of the crisis, where you have to do so many things at the same time that you always became more complicated, more difficult. One warning on my presentation, as every Spanish speaker, I tend to make up words, that they sound like English, but they are not an English word. So if you don't understand something, please, unfortunately, when we have something face to face, I can, with all this experience that after so many years of lecturing and teaching, and you start to find the faces and knowing the faces of the people if they understood or not. But now with these new technologies, result of the pandemic, becomes more difficult. So just stop me and ask any question that you have. I will start to share my PowerPoint presentation with you guys. So let's see if I do the things right. I've been with so many software for this type of meetings that, okay, it's okay? Can you see it? Perfect, great. So we talk a lot about the title, and as usual, the title gets the final version when you bring it to the last PowerPoint. So I was thinking, revisiting minimum wages 120 years later, its role in economic democratization. And I would like to, oops, this is not moving. Gee, something is going on. Oh, here it is. Lost in translation. And again, why this title? Well, on the one hand, you have to make titles a little bit catchy and provocative, but the issue is that in 120 years of the implementation of minimum wages, do we fully understand the role? Do we know what are they? And if I would have to summarize something about the minimum wage, I would say that it's the most effective and efficient income policy that the government can implement without paying, without cost. Why? Because you transfer that thing to the private sector mainly. Of course, you have to pay the public service, but that's part of the role, the role of the government, as an actor in the economic sphere rather than defining institutions. Okay, what is the minimum wage? The minimum wage is the minimum amount of remuneration that an employer is required to pay wage earners for the work performed during a given period. That's obvious. That's the definition that you find in the ILO conventions, for example. The convention of the ILO are the legal backbone of the ILO. And when they say minimum wage, they define like that. It's a very general thing. But the main thing that the ILO says, that it cannot be reduced by collective agreement or individual contract. That means if there is a minimum wage, which is a statutory, it's a legal determination, but the government, nobody can jump say, you cannot as an employer come and say, no, my worker told me that I can pay him less than that. No, the minimum wage has the enforcement of a law, which is not a minor detail, especially in some countries where you have huge numbers of informal workers, non-registered, temporary, seasonally in and out, and all these other type of arrangement. Which are the objectives according to the ILO convention? The first one, and it comes since, on the one hand, the constitution of the ILO, but also in the different conventions that refer to a minimum wage, is to protect workers against unduly low pay. Yeah, that's, as you can see, it's a legal definition. Yeah, the ILO concentrated in the legal definition of the minimum wage. Second, to ensure a just and equitable share of the fruit of progress to all, thinking in this idea of the social dialogue, the collective bargaining, the negotiations. We have to share in equitable way the share of progress. It tends to go one step forward of the trickle down or all these other ideas that first you have to enlarge the cake, then you distribute. No, the idea is a simultaneity in the process. Also provides a minimum living wage to all who are employed, but they need that protection, because you can be employed in a category that was defined as the working poor, yeah? So you provide a minimum living wage, a minimum living remuneration. We can discuss later this, or we can make some questions. And also, it's a policy tool to overcome poverty and reduce inequality at many levels. I will try to advance with that later. How did the issue of minimum wage appears in the International Labor Standard Framework? The concept of minimum wage evolved from a very selective policy or the recommendation to be used in low-wage sectors in the mid-20s, in the International Labor Standards, to become of a more broader coverage. And we will see later when we discuss why minimum wage recovered relevance. For example, in countries like Germany, implemented minimum wage in 2015, or Malaysia, why it became relevant now, and we will understand this part. So for the ILO, there are two key conventions. One was the minimum wage fixing machinery that talked mainly about industry, was in 1928, just months before the recession, the pre-Great Recession. We can talk about the new Great Recession now, but the old Great Recession. And then in the 70s, which was, if you think in 1970, was the peak of the more Keynesian type of growth with the welfare state and all these institutions that we used to know until the conservative revolution. Sorry for using the word revolution, but the conservative revolution by Thatcher, Reagan, and the Washington Consensus. And the definition was that it was meant for all groups of wage earners whose terms of employment are such that the coverage would be appropriate. That means precarious work, low skills, segments of the population that they are young or first-time workers. They say that the minimum wage has to apply to all. So it's a universal idea. What are the elements that you consider in the process of the minimum wage setting and adjustments? And that's also the ILO recommendation that we will discuss later. First, they say that they should take into the considerations for the determination and adjustment of the minimum wages, the needs of workers and their families, taking into account general wages of the country, the cost of living, the social security benefits, and the living standards of other social groups. We can see that here you can operationalize all these concepts very easy. The needs of workers and the family, although it's a relative concept, but you can use absolute measures in terms of basic needs. You can use relative measures like saying 60% of the median expenditure, or you can say the food needs for the basic living needs plus the Engel coefficient. There are a number of devices, economic and arithmetic devices to make this calculation. The general wages in the country, it's also very easy to see. And there are a number of studies that I had the luck to participate on precisely how to refer the minimum wages to other wages, because what you can see, especially after the 80s, it's a process of polarization of higher wages, the labor market aristocracy sort of saying, those are the Silicon Valley versus the California Valley of vegetables and migrant workers collectors, talking about valleys in the West Coast. So there are ways of checking that and to reduce that gap. And also the living standards of other social groups. When you have countries where large chunks of self-employment, informal workers, farmers or workers in the rural sector, you can check that. But also you have to consider other factors that are the economic factors, the requirements of economic development, the levels of productivity, the desirability of attaining and maintaining high levels of employment. These two definitions are clear in the Convention 131 and the Recommendation 135. And there are some issues because what are the requirements of economic development? If you see the B factors are much more questionable, or not questionable because they are good things, but they are less easy to find the right indicator for that. And that's part of the big discussion. Who should be subject of the minimum wage? So if we simulate here a distribution of wages, we have on the horizontal axis, we have the wage levels from the lowest to the highest, and we have a cumulative the distribution, frequency distribution of workers. We find that in modern economies, the collective bargaining zone is the light blue there, where the workers, they have unions that represent them, so they negotiate the collective bargaining according to their industry, to the sector, to the qualification, etc., etc. But always you have a number of workers that either are in the bottom levels. I don't know if you can see here my cursor also with that I'm moving. You can see it?
Yes, we can see the cursor too. Yeah.
Okay. You have here these workers that are in the bottom of the collective bargaining that sometimes are left out. Let's suppose those that they do cleaning in the pharmaceutical industry. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry will negotiate all the wages for the technical people, for the operations people, but then you have those that they do unskilled labor there, and they are sometimes left behind in the negotiation. So the minimum wage will cover them, will push them. But also those that are outside of the collective bargaining because they don't have unions to represent them, they don't have the capacity to be represented. And that's something that if you see what has been happening in the last years, it's a sector that has been increasing significantly. It's not anymore like used to be in the 70s when I used to work, was exchange student in the United States, and I was a busboy in a restaurant that, well, for me was great, the minimum wage. Now you don't have only the McDonald's first-time workers. You have a number of other activities because of the technological base of the business or things like that, that they are left behind because they don't have representation. They cannot be represented by a union. So this would be the light green area, would be the minimum wage segment. What is expected from a statutory minimum wage? First of all, and what I say previously, to fulfill the needs of the workers and the families. Yeah, because we are talking about human beings, about workers. And one of the characteristics is that although the employment is a condition of the individual, yeah, the person, the woman and the man as individual, the expenditure is a family business, sort of say, yeah, because with that salary, you have to fulfill, and you have cases like Indonesia that had a very crazy minimum wage law. Now it's much more crazy, but in the past they used to say the minimum wage should be suffice to maintain a single individual worker that is in his first job. Yeah, that would be great if you have a collective bargaining system and a promotion system, things like that. But in general, we are talking about families, to help families. The second topic, or the second condition that we expect from the minimum wage, is to have sustainable enterprises. Why is that? Well, because we need to guarantee that we are not jeopardizing the profits of enterprises. We are talking about the capitalist system. So enterprises, they have to be sustainable. And what means sustainable? They have to have reasonable profits, not only to still living, but also to be able to replace the capital stock and to maintain in the future the level of employment. So we need that balance, but also we have a public good type of balance, which is the steady economic growth with high rates of employment. We want economic growth, and we also want that economic growth to be translated into high levels of employment, not to leave people behind as we have the jobless growth that we saw in many countries. So that means that we have to interact with three different spheres according to the parties involved: workers and families, employments and enterprises, and governments in the dual role of employers and tax collectors, and and goods and services provided for the rest of the community. So if we think about good wages, fair wages, decent wages, sensible wages, acceptable wages, or functional minimum wages, they should consider the three things. If you set, for whatever reason, a minimum wage that is too high to fulfill the needs of workers and the family, but it's against the sustainability of enterprises, it's not a great idea. So you have to maintain this fine-tuning to keep the things. But one of the problems is that you cannot fine-tune the minimum wage, that you say, okay, now it's high, I reduce it, I put it high again, or reduce. It's not like a radio that you go the fine-tuning. You have to be very careful about that, because remember, wages or the labor market are the mechanism that link the economy with the well-being of the households. By means of what? By means of the salaries, the wages, the incomes that workers receive in the market. Okay, which are the advantages and disadvantages of a minimum wage? And this to be very comparisons in a nutshell, I titled this. First of all, we generate wage-led growth if you have a sensible policy of minimum wages, because you boost domestic demand and that push for investment by expectations. The workers, they spend all the money. You remember Kaletsky simplification saying workers spend all that they earn, and the capitalists earn all that they spend. So it's there you have this recursive process. Then reduce inequality or inequity, according to what would you like, pushes the bottom layer of the labor market up. So you reduce, you get it, make it closer in the process of strong polarization, and equalize wages of different groups. Equalize wages between men and women, ethnic groups, age group, skills, whatever. And then, of course, reduce poverty. Why? Because improve the overall household income. Which are the disadvantages especially according to the canonical wisdom or conventional wisdom? It may reduce employment in certain contexts. If you set up a minimum wage that is too high with a context of no other alternative, it may reduce employment. People or some enterprises will tend to invest more in capital goods. In developing countries, capital goods in general tend to be imported. So you may have a capital flight, It may push prices up if you have oligopolistic conditions in the market, and they can transfer the prices. In Latin America, and this is a quite sensitive issue, especially in my country, in Argentina. It may reduce the incentive for collective bargaining at sectoral level. Well, you have a very dynamic minimum wage, and I saw this in many countries in Asia. So the unions and employers say, okay, let's follow up what the minimum wage is doing. And sometimes that can be a good thing because you adjust wages according to the wages of the lowest sectors or the lower incomes, but also it may preclude the incentive for discussing non-wage conditions in collective bargaining, which are also very important, working time, overtime, other benefits, like childcare or health benefits. So that can be a problem. And also, in some cases, when you export your wage good, like in my country, it may reduce the exportable surplus if you have wages that are too high and they buy much more of the exportable surplus, and the adjustment of the productivity in the exportable sector is slower than what you increase the real purchasing power of the workers. And also, it may increase informality. If the minimum wage is too high, well, you have an incentive to say to the worker, okay, but I won't register you as a worker. So yeah, I will pay you the minimum wage, but I won't make the contributions to the social security. I won't make the contributions to the union. I won't make the contributions to the health system. Okay, so which are the main questions around the minimum wage? And here is my previous ILO experience. We really trust on the consultation with social partners to define, number one, the coverage of the minimum wage. Which are the sectors that have to be covered? In principle, as broad as possible, as many sectors as possible, that would afford protection to all workers. So the regulation has to be such that you include not only the regular industrial urban sector, that was the main topic during the boom of the minimum wage, but also you have to think what happened with domestic workers. And when I talk about domestic workers, it's not only house helpers or maids, but also I'm talking about per piece workers in cottage industries that are quite frequent in many countries. Also, you have to think about the level to cover the needs of the workers and their families, but an important issue is compliance. If you don't have compliance, if the minimum wage is not binding, if you have enterprises that they don't pay, if you have ways of circumval, I think it's the word, when the regulation, you are lost. because you will have the most powerful, that they have dozens of accountants and lawyers trying to find those ways. They will always find the Uber way of Cabify or whatever way of not attaching to the regulation. Okay, let's see the timeline, because you may say, okay, you talk about 120 years. Are there 120 years? Well, the first minimum wage, 1894, New Zealand. That was the first minimum wage. And when you think in New Zealand, well, you think a green, those that they saw the Lord of the Rings and all these films talking about New Zealand, and you think green hills and cows and some sheep and all. Why they implemented the minimum wage? Well, because they needed to start to develop their cottage industry. And that was key for a country that had very little exportable surplus by that time. Yeah, only wool, and that's it. The rest was domestic market. The second one, 1896, Australia. And there, the minimum wage was the result of an almost civil war between the farmers, that they were mainly oriented like the cotton producers in the South, in the United States. They were oriented to export wool to England, but they also wanted, they have the other sector, that was the urban sector, that they wanted to develop a domestic market. I'm missing there, sorry, I don't know why I miss it. 1910, UK. The United Kingdom started to implement minimum wages at the beginning of the 20th century, also precisely because they saw that after the big boom of the Industrial Revolution of the first years, that everything looked so interesting and so expanding, they started to see, especially in the period previous to World War I, they started to see limitations to cover certain sectors. Of course, the labor movement and the labor government in the UK at the beginning of the century, was very different from the third way that we saw in the 21st century of the labor government. 1938, the United States, when after the crisis of the 30s, in a very, I would say, moving speech by FDR, by Roosevelt, where he said, if the survival of enterprises depends of paying wages that are under the living wage, we don't want those enterprises. So they set up the minimum wage in 1938, and it was a very significant one, complemented precisely by all the recovery policies during that period. If you guys have those that they live in the States have the opportunity to go to the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C., it's one of the most touching places that you can find there. You will see the timeline, the story, and how the minimum wage is quite a relevant issue. In Argentina, we had in 1945 the first minimum wage in South America that was implemented by the Peronist government with all the laws and the regulation that guarantee pay holidays. They guarantee the 13th salary, what we call aguinaldo in Spanish, which is the 13th salary at the end of the year. Latin America in the 60s, they started with a strong implementation of the minimum wage. And there you can see, those are the years where the import substitution industrialization pick up very strongly, and you needed purchasing power in your domestic market in order to guarantee those infant industries to have their own markets, like Prebisch used to say. So the minimum wage was a very relevant tool for the development. You may ask me, before we go to Eastern Europe, you may ask me, well, but what happened with Europe during those years? Well, remember, Europe after World War II especially Germany, they have very strong systems of collective bargaining. The unions, after the liberation of Europe, they became very strong. They were an integral part of the political system, even with legislative representation of union leaders in the different parliaments in Italy, in the UK, in Germany, in Austria, that the collective bargaining guaranteed the coverage to all workers. In the 90s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, most of the countries of Eastern Europe started to implement minimum wages. China did it in 95, coincidental with the picking up of the market policies and market economy and the opening. We had the crisis of 2008, and that changed the shape of the wage negotiation, especially in the Southeast Asia or Asia in general. So we have 2014 in Cambodia, the minimum wage, that was the result after a big fight with people dying in the streets of Phnom Penh, and they implemented minimum wage, and they had an incredible adjustment of minimum wage. I don't want to go into the detail of the different countries, but 2015 we have Germany. Why Germany? Because they found out that the collective bargaining wasn't enough to cover the increasing informal sector, the new technological-based type of contracts and arrangements, and at the same time Malaysia, which was the first Southeast Asian country that ratified the minimum wage convention. So let me see, this is more or less the timeline to see, so you can see and relate how the minimum wage is always related to periods where you need to boost the domestic market. Yeah. We have in 90% of the 187 countries, member states of the countries, where you have a minimum wage that is statutory or negotiated according to the different type of institutional arrangement. You can see that the Nordic countries, they still don't have a statutory one because the collective bargaining there is much stronger, and they have all the social benefits and employment benefits and child allowance and all these things linked to the minimum wage. One of the main questions that the people tend to say or to talk about is that the minimum wage is only for formal workers. Yeah, those that are registered, that they are declared to the social security system. And it's very difficult to prove that in general, but here I'm going to show you, I would say, almost a laboratory example, of a minimum wage policy, because in general, you have the minimum wage, so it's very difficult to do. So we pick up the example of Myanmar. I'm going to show you the kernel distribution of wages in Myanmar in 2015, before the minimum wage was implemented. So we have the zero, where are the majority of the wages, yeah, here in this case, and we can see, where is my cursor? Here it is. We can see that this peak is zero. What did we use as zero? We use the median wage in the country, the prevailing median wage that year. So, because we didn't have a minimum wage. And we find that you have a bump of very low wages here. Then you have a bump of significantly higher of wages that are under the minimum wage. And then you have these two bumps of more skilled workers that are at the right hand of the median wage, the salary that represents half of the workers. And you can see that the majority is concentrated here. In 2015, the government at the end, actually was 2016, but this is a distribution immediately before minimum wage was implemented, the minimum wage was implemented. So we check what happened in the second survey in 2017. And we can see here, number one, Zero would be the minimum wage minus the existing salary of individual workers. So this would be the kernel distribution. We have a band of workers not as high as before in relation to the others, but very much closer to the minimum wage of the low-skilled workers. Then we have here all the workers that are around a little bit over the minimum wage, and here we have the skilled workers. We see how the distribution has been homogenized with implementation. Why? Because there is a lighthouse effect. You know, in Myanmar, I remember when I was working there, you would have every single day in the newspapers the price of gasoline, petroleum, the price of the kilo of rice, the price of gold, the gram of gold, the price of the dollar, the exchange rate, and you would have them as a clear reference of markets. But there was no reference before about the price of labor. Yeah, a worker that was coming from the rural sector or informal worker, when he wanted to charge for his working time, he didn't know very well. When you have a minimum wage, you have that lighthouse effect. It's a signal. They know that they have to be paid around the minimum wage or at least the minimum wage. And employers, sometimes they are jerks that they want to exploit the workers, but in general, employers, they don't want to be seen as exploiting, especially Buddhist countries, yeah, where they are very much concerned about the karma that they transfer to other people. So the existence of a minimum wage becomes a strong lighthouse effect. And this is something that we saw very frequently in South America, in Latin America in general. The lighthouse effect is the only revealing signal of the labor market as a whole. In general, at the ILO and also me as an economist, I like simple systems. We want single minimum wage in the country. Why? Because it plays this role of the signal. But unfortunately, we have systems where you have more than one minimum wage. And then we have those that they are very chaotic, like Indonesia, that used to have 240 different rates because the rates were defined at city or municipality level. But in general, when you have a single system, it's more efficient. But of course, when you don't have a broad collective bargaining or you have very strong regional differences, well, you may implement other systems. So here we have the different type of systems. Some of them are by occupational category, some others are by region, some others are by sector or industry, and some others are with age groups, and in some cases they mix them. You may have younger workers, first-time workers, less than 1 year, you know, by seniority in the job. So we have multiple rates, and this is more or less clear, so I will start to speed up. At the ILO, we produce the Global Wage Report, which is written every 2 years, and last year was precisely about minimum wage and the post-pandemia. So if we have to calculate how much would be the median value of the gross minimum wage in 2019 would be $486 purchasing power parity. So you will have to check the purchasing power parity that is calculated by the World Bank for the different countries. But of course, that doesn't mean that if you live in Manhattan, you will survive with $486 in purchasing power parity, but this was the way that we had to try to define this category. So anyhow, you have 327 million wage earners that are under, that would be 19% of the labor force worldwide that they are paid under the minimum wage, or at least the level or under the minimum wage. How frequently minimum wages are adjusted? And this is another issue because you say, no, we have a very thoughtful policy of minimum wage, but if you don't adjust it time by time, as is in the recommendation, well, you may have cases like in the United States that you've been having the same minimum wage for how many, 30 years in some states, that they still have the 6 to 75. When
No,
I was
the federal minimum wage hasn't been increased since 2009.
okay, that's the federal, but I remember when I was working in Kearney, Nebraska, I used to earn 175 per hour. Yeah, what would be 50 years later, 48 years later, the 175 that I earned at that time that they allow me to go to listen to concerts and to have nice meals and all those things. So the frequency of the adjustment is important. We have that the majority of the countries, they have an adjustment that is at least every 2 years, but you still have countries where the adjustment is longer than that. Which is the impact of inequality? And there comes one of our strong points that we prove that in our report. The impact on inequality, independent of which is the measure that you use. You may use the Gini coefficients, extreme deciles, the Palma index. We found that for example, in Europe, the impact of the minimum wage is really strong. And we made these two simulations. One simulation is just by having full compliance. And that shows you how it would reduce the Palma ratio. The Palma ratio is the top 90% over the lowest 10%. If you just have full compliance using microdata, you will get the increase that is in the light blue line for the different countries. But if you have the minimum wage set in relative terms to 67% of the median salary, that would be 2/3 of the median wage, the wage that receives 50% of all the workers, the impact is much strong. In some countries, the impact is not that big, like France, and you will learn later why. But in most of the country, the impact is very strong. Yeah. What happened with the gender pay gap? Well, we find that women are paid less than the minimum wage in most of the situation. They are below or at the most at the level of minimum wage, while women above the minimum wage are just significantly less. So they will also receive that impact if you would bring them to the compliant or to the 60% of the average wage. What happened with poverty? With the same simulation that I mentioned to you before, we will have the same impact. The overwhelming majority of European countries, we're talking about European countries where you guess that unions, they have their bargaining power, that they have, we find how important it's going to be the minimum wage. So what this have to do, because the first criticism that you will make, I say, okay, but you are talking about regular times, normal times, we're in a crisis, we have COVID. Well, during the COVID, we found that it's essential an adequate balance of the policy adopted implemented, because precisely you are affecting the remuneration of the working. There are less working hours, there are less shifts in most of the enterprises, and even in those countries that they have policies that maintain employment, remunerations are going to be lower, less working hours. Yeah, even if they respect your job, if they respect your basic salary, you are not going to get the plus for productivity, the plus for attendance, the plus for sometimes seniority, you know. So, and if on top of that, you add underemployment of labor, high level of unemployment, state intervention has to be necessary to avoid this, even at the level of maintaining the adjustment of the minimum wage. Then we have the big role played by wage subsidies. You know, in the Global Wage Report, we made an analysis of all the alternative wage subsidies, that there are different ways to the unemployed, to the enterprises to retain employees, to wage bill or payroll-based loans for enterprises to maintain the workers with conditionality. And after the COVID, the relevance becomes much more, because if you have a situation of heterogeneous of economic recovery, some enterprises that they didn't close because they were essential, they can produce, some others they have to reopen, like the entertainment sector, movie theater, things like that, or holiday resorts. So you need to set up a base for that. We also found there, but I won't stop here, because this is interesting but lengthy, that minimum wages can be a policy for accelerate the achievement of SDGs. Why is that? Because we have found that we have direct linkages with some of the indicators, and also a large number of indirect linkages. That makes that the monitoring of wage policies in a broader context, I don't have time to show you, we also developed a dashboard for monitoring wage policies, becomes essential. Okay, why minimum wage revived today? Even before, I put in the timeline, please tell me when I have 10 minutes remaining only. I put in the timeline the 2008 I would say point, because we find that there are many causes why the minimum wage revive, but most of them are interlinked. First one, the structural constraints of economies to generate well-paid formal jobs. And this is not only a problem as used to be when we study about informality and dual labor markets in South America or in Asia, because this is happening in developed economies. This is happening at the same time that we see increasing the number of billionaires. Yeah, we have lousily paid jobs in the enterprises of the billionaires, in Jeff Bezos, in Zuckerberg, and in Elon Musk, not to personalize workers. I'm sure that even those that are working in the rocket that we send Jeff Bezos to space and hopefully never return, keep him there. I'm sure that the cleaning people, they don't receive a reasonable wage, although he's spending a lot of money. We also have a crisis of collective bargaining. Yeah, in many countries, we found that the unions, they reduce the level of unionization. Younger people, they don't find intuitively, why should I join a union to feed these fat guys that they only negotiate for themselves? That happened in many times. Sometimes it's responsibility of the unions, but also responsibility of the media, that they pick up any of the mainstream media. You won't see a single phrase in favor of the union, a single phrase. Also, well, that's the reduction of the rate of enrollment to unions. Also, the expansion of the so-called working poor, those that they either because they don't work enough hours or because the pay is very low according to their working conditions. Increasing informalization of workers, non-registration of workers, and non-standard forms of employment, gig economy, platform economy, and there are a number of names. I was trying to collect, but finally, a colleague of mine at the ILO, Uma Rani, who did a great analysis of the platform economy, she collected a number of per piece employment, yeah, per job, per task employment. So you find ways of non-standard forms of employment that they start to be prevailing. does that mean that we have to, through all what we have learned about the formal employment, the industrial relations of the past? Not at all. We have to fully keep them working. Okay, some dilemmas of the minimum wage. The first of all is that, well, in minimum wages, you have an imperfect information and an interest, sorry, the one that pays is not the one that receives, the one that receives is not the one that defines the law, which is a very, very clear. When you read Stiglitz, you understand why sometimes it's so difficult. If you go to see the negotiation in the minimum wage regimes, you will find something that is sometimes a little bit funny, because the workers, the union leaders say, well, but in my union, I get higher salaries than what we are negotiating here. So they don't fully represent those workers that are the sub-minimum wages. And the employers say, well, I don't know how they can survive with this minimum wage. In my enterprise, I pay much more. So you find that those that are negotiating are not the ones that are paying or receiving. That can be a problem. Then you have this conflict between to set up the minimum wage in an evidence-based approach, that means looking at the prices and other wages or the regular negotiation. Let them go, negotiate, you don't say anything. The other tension is between one single minimum wage or multiple minimum wages. The other tension, and this is an interesting, the minimum wage is a trigger of collective bargaining or a corrector. If you go and you see what happened in South America or in Eastern Asia, where the collective bargaining is a little bit lazy, yeah, because you have enterprise negotiations or more limited negotiations. If you push up there is laziness in the collective bargaining, because the workers, they don't want to ask more, they're afraid that they could be replaced, and the employers don't want to pay more, because employers never want to pay more salaries or taxes. Yeah, they don't care paying PR, fancy dinners, trips in business class in the airplanes, but when it comes to wages, they have a matter of principle there. They are very much against paying salaries. So if you push up the minimum wage, you trigger the collective bargaining, because the skilled workers say, well, I used to earn 4 times the minimum wage, now I am 2.5. So I will go to negotiate an increase. In some other countries, it's a corrector. The minimum wage is aimed to correct what has been happening in the collective bargaining. The collective bargaining, the more dynamic sectors, they have higher wages, so the minimum wages are far away. The policy is to correct that. And then you have mixed system. Okay. I will
How much do you have? Can we do 5 minutes to wrap up?
I think that we can, so I won't stop here in the use of formulas, that they were quite interesting. So I will wrap up with the minimum wage as employment guarantee, because we already talked, I guess, in the previous conferences about employment guarantee. Are complementary, competitive, substitution. And here, I would like to show you some of the things that I find that are quite relevant. Let me, I have okay, here. Without minimum wage, without an employment guarantee. There is a minimum wage, but without full employment, that means that you may have unemployment. So the capacity of negotiation of those that they have a job, it becomes weakened. Workers may be willing to work for salaries that are under the mandatory minimum wage. Firms may hire informal or non-registered workers. Why? Because workers are willing to work for salaries that are under the mandatory minimum wage or under the other conditions of the formal work, like severance pay, contributions to the social security, the pension, the health system. Compliance is low and overlooked when you have unemployment in the minimum wage, with the minimum wage. And you may have a plethora of informal jobs and self-employment that some of them are under the minimum wage. Minimum wage isn't a reference anymore. You may have a very good minimum wage, but if you have all these other conditions, the minimum wage is going to be undermined by the prevailing economic and social conditions. What happened with the employment guarantee program? The employment guarantee sets a value for the lower tier of the economy, in general, at the minimum wage level or a little bit under the minimum wage, like we had in the case of the Jefes program that was under the minimum wage. It hires those workers that they can find a job in the formal markets. Workers aren't willing to take an informal job. Why? Because the employment guarantee program is going to absorb them. It's going to provide them a job. So the employers, those that they don't want to pay the minimum wage, have less power. It protects the benefits of the formalization, pension, healthcare, and working time. And also strengthens the bargaining power of workers, even at the individual level, because the worker can go and say to the employer, listen, if you don't give me this remuneration of these labor conditions, I will go to the employment guarantee program. So the conclusion is there is full compatibility between the two measures. The minimum wage set the reference of the price of the labor market economy-wide. It helps to contextualize and define the benefit of the employment guarantee program. If you don't have a minimum wage, you have to justify very strongly how much is going to be the employment guarantee program. But when you have the minimum wage, you cannot say many things. You say, okay, we'll be at the level or a little bit less, but can't be too far away. It provides political legitimacy to the employment guarantee program when you have a minimum wage and the value paid to the beneficiaries independent of what they are doing. And also the employment guarantee benefit defines the rock bottom floor to start negotiation at the minimum wage, even in settings where you don't have very flourishing negotiations. The linkages are not linear, but rather interactive. They reinforce both alternatives. So I would like to finish with the phrase of an Argentinian poet, Leopoldo Marechal, who used to say in a very nice poem called Laberintos de Amor, that would be labyrinth or maze of love. He say, from every maze, you can only exit from above. Don't try to follow the path of the common sense or the conventional wisdom. Just try to come from top, and the minimum wage and the employment guarantee are the way forward when you have this type of conundrum. I think it's the other English word. Thank you very much. I hope that wasn't too long, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Daniel. It was great. Thank you for this really clear historical and just institutional analysis. I'm gonna open the floor to questions. I encourage our guests and students to use the raise hand function. But you're also welcome to copy questions in the chat box that we can moderate. So don't be shy, but maybe I can start us off with one question. Okay, well, two questions. So you may know in the job guarantee, employment guarantee literature, sometimes we often say that the minimum wage or the wage at the employment guarantee can be used to, in fact, raise wages beyond the minimum wage in places where the minimum wage policies are weak or they are not being revised as frequently. So in the United States, our proposal is for a job of 15. Even though the federal minimum wage is still stuck at $7.25, there are still, state-based initiatives to raise the minimum wage. And our argument has been that those can be supported if we did a job guarantee at 15. And in your remarks, you were talking about setting it at the minimum wage or maybe slightly below. So if you want to, if you could please elaborate on that a little bit, and then what would be some useful markers to think about raising the wage? What would be the way to think about, when and mechanism by which it could be raised?
My impression is, Pavlina, that the federal minimum wage in the United States is quite meaningless. Let's be honest. How many hours you have to work to reach a poverty line of a family of 4 if you are earning $7.25, especially if you have to pay for health or housing or other benefits. So when I say that should be at the level of the minimum wage or perhaps a little bit under, but I'm thinking about the minimum wage, which is, I don't know, well, first of all, above the poverty line, so would be a living wage. Remember, the minimum wage is a legal concept. Living wage is a much more operational, economic, or nutritional, sociological, anthropological type of concept. So I strongly think that if you have an employment guarantee and the minimum wage is not binding, it's meaningless in terms of it has to be above that, it's not cast in stone. When I say at the level or under the level, is when I'm thinking that you have a level of wages that fulfills one of the conditions that you remember, the 3 pillars, the needs of the worker and the families, sustainable enterprises, and economic growth with high levels of employment. You may have the first two pillars, but you have increasing unemployment. Yeah, there is when you have to put the minimum wage, the employment guarantee at the level of the minimum wage would be. But if you have the other situation where actually the problem of your economy is the lack of purchasing power of the minimum wage on top of the working poor of the unemployed, the employment guarantee has to be above that. This is not cast in stone. So that's one of the things that you have to, when I say, and perhaps we can do another, for those that they are interested in another chat on the monitoring wage policies, the dashboard for monitoring, that's where the thing comes to play its role.
And markers on increasing it, once it is set, suppose appropriately as a labor standard that conforms to all the criteria you listed, then what would be the way to think about raising it and maintaining the appropriate labor standard?
I think that there are 2 avenues of operation in that respect. One of them is, of course, you have a follow-up on the cost of living in general, and the relationship with other wages. If you see, like for example, in France or the Netherlands, and if you distribute, I sent you the PowerPoint presentation later, you will see that France or the Netherlands, how do they adjust the minimum wage? In France, they take the reference of the blue-collar worker, the salary of the blue-collar worker that is negotiated in the collective bargaining, and they apply to it the cost of living. So they mix the 2 things and they adjust the minimum wage according to that, because that's the correction. The the collective bargaining goes faster than the minimum wage. So after every 6 months, you bring it back to the same relationship. You can do that with the blue collar. You can do it like in the Netherlands. They do it also twice per year with the weighted average of all the collective bargaining. They bring all the agreements together, they weight it, and they calculate how much the salary of the formal workers increase, and they bring the minimum wage to that level. And if you have an employment guarantee, you follow the same trend. You follow the same trend. Some other countries, it's much more complex, especially those where the collective bargaining is lazy. As I told you, for example, Malaysia, that I was planning to explain, but went too long to explain a little bit more, the formula, they take into account the cost of the poverty line that they take as a base, but they also take into account the median wages, and they average both. So they say the cost of the poverty line tells you the needs of the workers and the family. The median wages tell you how much enterprises are paying to the 50% of the worker. That means that it's possible for enterprises to pay. So that tells you the capacity of enterprises to pay. And then they adjust by the per capita productivity, GDP over labor force, every year, and they adjust by prices. So they mix these multiple criteria. What's the problem with those formulas? That number one, they preclude the collective bargaining. Because you have the formula, the information is there. It's what we call at the ILO the evidence base, and we preach it for the evidence base. Say, no, stop the negotiation, because in the negotiations, everybody said whatever, and you have indicators that are very clear. So you have to be very careful how do you use it. And I think it's very important that you see them, employers, workers, and government all together, and they all share the basic information and negotiate with that base. I always tell this anecdote. When did I decide to write this document on the dashboard for the monitoring of wages? And I think they are going to publish at the ILO soon. I was in Indonesia, and we were in the National Wage Council discussing on the minimum wage and the reform and the adjustment. And one of the employers, he came later to the meeting. And the guy said, the problem in this country is that the economy is not growing. So I had all my tables. I said, sorry, I think the economy grew 5.3% last year. And he said, well, yes, it's growing, but it's not generating employment. Sorry, employment grew by 2.5% last year. So that person never opened the mouth again in the meeting. He was very pushy at the beginning, but after I showed them the evidence, so I said, well, what we have to do is to have all the information that will be involved and what is discussed in the collective bargaining negotiation. One comes and say, poverty is increasing. The other comes and say, the prices are going up. We are exporting less. We don't have investment. We are closing enterprises. Enterprises are moving away from the country. So the idea is to define a dashboard that we consider the macro dimension of the discussion, the enterprise or micro dimension of the discussion, the distributional dimension, the poverty or the welfare part of the discussion, and also the fiscal sector discussion, because governments say, no, we cannot pay, we are reducing the collection of taxes, or our deficit is increasing. So we define this dashboard with all these indicators, say, okay, you all have this information, you can make your own arguments, but you cannot invent your data. As I say, you are entitled to your own arguments, you are not entitled to your own data if it's not true.
That's right. Thank you very much, Daniel. Great. I'm going to ask Max, who's from Taiwan, to ask his question, and then we'll take a couple from the chat.
Okay. Hello, Mr. Kostzer. So my
Hi,
question is
Max.
that as we implement minimum wage policy, there's a possibility that business owners might add up these costs and cause rising prices. And that might cause inflation and in turn harm the poor, which is the target audience of this minimum wage policy. So I just want to ask, like, in your opinion, is there any solution or is there anything that can alleviate this condition that probably wouldn't harm the poor so much?
That's a good question, and it's a question that I was a number of years in Asia, and I travel many countries in Asia discussing wages. And that's a question that always, unfortunately, I never went to your country because you are not part of the ILO for I say not obvious reasons, but unfortunately I never was able to go to Taiwan. But that was the same question that was asked in South Korea, which is a situation not exactly the same, but I would say similar. In South Korea, you had a very active minimum wage policy in the last 3-4 years, yeah? Very, very active. They increased significantly the minimum wage. And of course, South Korean employers, hardworking, tough people, they say that they weren't able to pay the minimum wages. And I show them that the increase in the cost of energy, the increase in the lease of shops was much stronger than the increase in the minimum wage. I show them that the share of wages in the total structure of costs of most of the enterprises, especially those that they face foreign competition, was less than 5%. That the main costs were capital stock and also land. The process of appreciation of real assets in Asia and the Pacific, but worldwide, the appreciation because of stock exchange speculation, it's so high that it's eating up part of the profits of these enterprises. And the only alternative that they see or they blame are wages. Huh? When you hear the cost of a lease per square meter in Taipei, in Seoul, in Bangkok, and the level of speculation that is behind that, you say, come on, don't blame workers. Don't blame workers. And that's something that governments have to be the real, I would say, referees in this discussion and in this negotiation. There is no justification that the problems of employment are due to the salaries. For sure, if you own a 7-Eleven or convenience store and the property, even if you are the owner of the property that you are located, used to cost, let's say, $500,000, $500,000, yeah? You were expecting to have at least 0.8, 1% per month in order to justify the investment that you made. That would be, if it's a 1%, if it's $500 million, that would be $5,000 per month, yeah? If that property went from $500,000 to $1 million, the same as happened since the 2008 crisis to 2018 in Seoul, in Bangkok, or in Taipei, for sure you will want to get 10,000, not 5,000. And wages didn't go up that much. And the part of wages on the total cost of production or total cost of activity, it's so much smaller, yeah? So as long as you have a process of appreciation of capital stock, you are going to face always this issue. And that's a macroeconomic problem, yeah, that start to build up bubbles. And the only way to stop those is when the bubbles, they burst. I think that Marx in the Capital used to say that in order to restore the rate of profits of the productive sector, you have to destroy capital stock. And by capital stock, it means the financial capital, you know, the cost of these bubbles. Right? Yeah. There's no clear evidence that the cost of unemployment is the increase of wages, especially minimum wages.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. That was great. I'll take 2 questions from the chat and then we'll turn to Eric, and we close a little bit, a few minutes after the top of the hour. But Nawid from Afghanistan is asking if minimum wages are so important to reducing inequality. Why stop there? Can we go beyond minimum wages to address, inequality? And Momo from Myanmar is asking, how can policymakers mitigate the risk of mass unemployment by setting wages, minimum wages?
Okay, I think both questions are related, and I understand that Momo is asking something that was my follow me during all my period in Myanmar and after that. Number one, if you go very much above minimum wages, I think that governments, they don't have the capacity to intervene in many more wages than the minimum wage. Why is that? There are a number of peculiarities in the different sectors. The same task in the vegetable oil industry is not the same that you have in other sectors of the food, even the food processing industry. So government, they don't have the capacity or the knowledge to do that. You have to leave that to the collective bargaining. In 2003, I saw one of my colleagues, former colleagues at the Ministry of Labor, but I think that she left already. I remember in 2003, even at the peak of the Jefes program, minimum wage was left behind in Argentina. And when the new government came, I started to preach for the minimum wage. And the unions used to come and say, no, you have to help us to better work in the structure, in the pyramids of our, and we found there a number of things that we didn't know about the different sectors. But for sure, we knew what should be the rock bottom of the labor market, and that was a minimum wage. So you push the floor and you trigger the collective bargaining according, of course, to the bargaining power of the different workers. And if you have sectors, let's say engineers in the car industry, that they didn't have enough collective power, okay, I'm sorry. I cannot do anything in that. I don't know your contribution to the production in your sector. I don't know your collective bargaining power. I cannot define how much you should earn in your tax. But for sure, I know how much should be the minimum wage. Should be enough to fulfill the needs of the worker and the family, should be a reasonable proportion of the median or the average wages of the other sectors, should be a reasonable proportion of how pensioners get or how rural workers or self-employed earn. So I don't think that it's sensible because of the lack of skills, the lack of information, how to define other wages that are above the minimum wage. The other issue is how can policymakers mitigate the risk of mass unemployment? Again, the evidence doesn't show that just because you increase minimum wages, you will have unemployment. What could be the problem? If you increase the minimum wages and you have full employment, or you don't have productive capacity, you may induce certain unemployment. Yeah, if you have what I remember Kernel used to talk about Keynesian and Marxian unemployment. For him, Keynesian unemployment was a problem of domestic demand, but you had the productive capacity. The Marxian unemployment was when you didn't have the potential or the productive capacity to increase the demand, and you may have inflation without the benefits, but that's also, again, context sensitive, that information. If you have excess capacity and you have unemployed people, your problem is aggregate demand. So perhaps minimum wage doesn't help because you have a large informal sector, you have a large rural sector, and that's where you need the employment guarantee. Yeah, the compatibility, the articulation between the employment guarantee and the minimum wage is full. And you as a government, you have to take, or a policy maker, you have to take care of both things. So again, I'm not afraid of what you are saying, because the best way by which policymakers can mitigate the eventual case that you have unemployment and excess capacity is by the employment guarantee program.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Okay, Eric Shirley is joining from New York City.
Thank you. One of the questions I want to ask you is, what was your biggest issues that the ILO had to go through in terms of assisting other countries?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the biggest issue in relation to, sorry?
The ILO.
Yes.
Yeah. What issues that you guys had to go through in terms of assisting other countries, in terms of minimum wage?
Okay, well, that's something that now I can say. The role of employers inside the ILO. The employers, you know, the ILO is a tripartite organization, workers, employers, and governments. Employers, they started during the last 20 years a strong campaign against the concept of living wage, against minimum wage. That's a big fight that we have with them. And for whatever reason that I don't want to outline here, employers, they reach the ears of government officials much more efficiently than workers, yeah? For some reason. And that was one of the big problems. One of my biggest failures was in the case of Indonesia, where we made proposal of a reform in the system. Everybody agreed with that. Our proposal was very well accepted. I even talked to the Minister of Finance, but when it came to reform the law, they made a, I would say, an arithmetic device that at the end is going to reduce wages. And although we warn against that and we put pressure against that, we fail. Employers, they have the ear of governments in general.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, we'll take one more question from Hassana, who is studying in Bishkek, American University of Central Asia, but is from Afghanistan.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
And thank you so much for today's lecture. It was very wonderful and interesting, but full of information about macroeconomics policy, because it's my major and concentration. I would like to ask about like labor market with inequality, because I wanted to ask about like how this economic inequality or gender inequality might have impact in minimum wage. Because in terms of econometrics, as we studied, we have statistics that how about the women are educated and how they can have impact in business and in work. So how this minimum wage might be effective in this case?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and again, I show you some of the slides, and if you go to the Global Wage Report to the 2020, you will get more detail, technical detail there. it's in general, depending how you measure inequality, but you have to see all the dimensions, because if you use, for example, the Gini coefficient, you have the overall distribution and the overall inequality. If you have extreme deciles, you may have another picture. So you have to cross them together. But again, the minimum wage, what it does if you fix the rest of the distribution and you push up the bottom of the distribution, econometrically and arithmetically, it's going to reduce inequality automatically. Yeah, of course, that thing doesn't always happen, because if you and that's I would say the intriguing and wonderful thing of our discipline. You put more money in the pockets of the workers, but the workers, they go and they buy in the corner shop, and the corner shop goes and buy to the producer. So you push the floor, but you also, instead of the trickle down that you just directly put the money on the pockets of the richer and it should trickle, but as a friend of mine used to say, it's like clown's pockets, that they are very deep, they are never get full. Yeah, you flood the bottom and it starts to evaporate to the top very rapidly. Yeah, the good thing is that you improve the well-being of those workers, but you also need taxing policies in order to reduce that. After the first round in the Keynesian multiplier cycle, yeah, after the first round, those that are in the top, they get more than what they got at the bottom, even if they satisfy their basic needs. So you need a combination of policies, and you need the very close monitoring to that. If you want, perhaps because I see Pavlina's face, that we are over time, but if you want to discuss a little bit more on that, please don't hesitate contacting me. I will leave my email if you want more precise or more discussion, more adjusted to what you are doing. Would be my pleasure.
Sure. Thank you so much, sir, for your kindness and generosity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. I was looking for the full quote that you had at FDR, and I just have it right in front of me. No business which depends for existence on paying less than a living wage to its workers has any right to continue in this country. And by living wage, I mean more than the bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of a decent living. And so I think that, it's really, I think it's so important for you to give us this perspective that while we are talking about the rock bottom, we still have this broader aspiration that whoever may be working at that rock bottom actually is deserving of a decent life and a decent standard of living, not just bare minimum. So I really thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you entertaining the questions. Thanks to everyone who joined the session. Join us on Thursday with another talk, this time on democratizing the firm and democratic decision-making and information sharing within the firm. Okay, thank you, Daniel, again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.